All right. So this is going to be fun. Reminder folks, if any of these things are, you feel like you need a refresher or anything like that, Matt and I will be doing an in-depth reading of the Communist Manifesto for Left Reckoning patrons this month of August. But
Dr. Jordan Peterson, you're welcome to
Jordan Peterson and the latest entry. What's his name? Who's the other guy? The sword man. James Lindsay. James Lindsay's welcome to watch. And the latest entry in right-wing guys who talk a lot, don't know shit about Marx. The latest entrant in that is a Mr. Ben Shapiro, who on his little show breaks down history. And I know it's a longer video where who knows even where he ends up. But he does the kind of classic thing as acting as if Karl Marx is behind the entirety of the left cultural project, which is always very funny to me when they do that. But he eats shit. He starts talking about Marx and Marxism, what Marx thinks and how it was repudiated. And I think it's worthwhile to spend a little bit of time correcting him on this, because even though Ben Shapiro really just sort of cannonballs into shit here, I think the understanding that he presents here is a kind of pop understanding of Marx. So let's watch this and we'll respond to it. We're going to cut it up into 3 different parts here. I've cut in 3 different parts, but this is all one continuous monologue from Mr. Ben Shapiro.
Yeah, you sort of have to think of the framework of history, broad read. Okay, so Karl Marx famously says at the beginning of the Communist Manifesto, along with Engels, he says, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. And this is wrong. Now, that phrase has shaped nearly every theory about politics in the modern era. Everybody ranging from Francis Fukuyama to the Marxist theorists of the early 20th century.
Fukuyama is much more of a Hegelian than a Marxist, right? So we're already starting to get into murky waters here, but we don't need Ben to sort of be able to disentangle Marx from Hegel. Right?
The thing is like, look, I've read a Fukuyama book. I don't think it's the End of History, but like that's what he's famous for, right? Like how is that a class struggle? Like he says history was over. Like how is that remotely about?
Well, he says like history's over in the sense that we've achieved synthesis, because like the competing ideologies, the competing global movements of communism versus capitalism has reached synthesis. Again, like these are much more Hegelian of an understanding. I will say this isn't even the purpose of the segment. I would like to do some Fukuyama stuff because Fukuyama's on the right generally. I mean, this is like his argument. But it's almost cliche to attack him for the end of history thing at this point, obviously knowing what we know. It's worthwhile to read that piece because it's a lot more interesting than I think a lot of people give him credit for. But if we get into that, we will never get to this other shit. So let's jump into Ben Shapiro.
That everything is about class. Today's politicians, left and right, Bernie Sanders, and on the right, people like Tucker Carlson, very often tend to conflate issues that are values-laden.
We do love the intra right-wing war going on there, by the way.
Oh my God.
Let's let them go.
Yeah.
With issues that are economic-laden. So the idea is that the forgotten man is actually the person who's being left behind by the new meritocracy, by the economy, that everything is about class conflict. And if only we could redistribute, if only we could subsidize, we could do all of that and we could create solidarity again. All we would have to do is change the economic systems by which we live, and this would magically fix everything. But it's not true.
All right. First stop.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, if you want to jump in first, Matt, go for it.
Well, the other thing is like what the switch to forgotten man. I don't think Marx was like the forgotten men. It was workers.
Well, it's also redundant because he says the forgotten man has been forgotten by history, right? So already gotten there, Ben. No, I mean it's absurd. So let's break down what Ben Shapiro is saying, and then we can get to Marx, right? What Ben Shapiro is saying is that Marxism is a theory that there is a forgotten man, right? Who's been forgotten by history, right? Again, a very like bizarre and like idealist metaphorical understanding of history, which is very much in contradiction to Marx's very, very, very almost sometimes people say Marx is too materialistic, right? But forgotten by history, right? These are flowery terms. History is a living thing that's thinking and forgetting things. Anyway, And then so that this forgotten man of history has been left behind. And then if we change the economic system, right? That is true. Marxism doesn't want to change the economic system, and do more subsidies. Now we're getting into weird stuff here, right? Do more subsidies and have some redistribution. Well, a different distribution, certainly. But Marxism is a much grander philosophy than just saying, hey, the wealth that exists right now, we're just going to give it around, just have one big jubilee and give the money around. No, what it's saying is that the people who produce should be the ones in control of the things that they produce. They should be in control of their shop places, their workplaces, and the profit that is now extracted by an overlord, a capitalist, should be going to those workers instead of being going to this capitalist class, right? So already here we're in a bizarre point with Ben Shapiro about what he thinks Marxism's solutions are to like the puzzle of history. But you know what? We're not here to get worked up about Ben Shapiro's misunderstandings of Marxism as a political philosophy, as like a political program. Let's talk specifically about this theory of history that he says Marx is wrong about. Because famously, one thing that is very pertinent about Marx is that there are people who say, I'm no longer a communist or a socialist, but I still believe in the Marxist view of history, right? We can roll our eyes at those people, but there's a truth to it in the sense that like there is like a distinct political program that comes out of Marxism, right? That is like the socialist program, and then later the communist movements that follow it. But it comes out of a theory of history. And let's break down this theory of history really fast for folks to show why Ben Shapiro is so insane. And in a second, Ben Shapiro is about to give his golden argument as to why what in history has proven Marx wrong. But let's just break down for a second what Ben Shapiro is saying, that Marx says that all of history is class conflict, and that's wrong, right? And then Ben Shapiro doesn't go into history and instead makes a very weird and inaccurate argument about what Marxism prescribes as the solution to the problems of our society. But let's just go down to the next line of the Communist Manifesto, where Marx starts to break this down a little bit. So the first line is Ben Shapiro, which is also, this is chapter 1, so not the introduction. After the first line that Ben cites, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Next line, if only Ben Shapiro read a little bit longer, he might have had a stronger argument here. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guild master and journeyman. In a word, oppressor and oppressed stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. This matters. We'll get to this later. And then I won't read through the entirety of the opening chapter of the Communist Manifesto. We'll do that later this month for people. But he goes on to talk about the modern bourgeoisie society, and what makes it unique compared to all of these previous class struggles. I will just say, as like a political theory and political history nerd, this concept of class in society as driving history is not even a Marxist one. This goes back all the way to the ancients. Plato writes about this. Most famously, the person who sort of picks up the kind of incongruent, underdeveloped theory, the one who people know as sometimes the father of political science or political philosophy, I should say, Machiavelli. Machiavelli is somebody who very clearly understands the class nature of society and how it drives history. And throughout his entirety of his work, is sort of breaking this down. So again, this isn't some kind of novel idea that comes solely from Marx. Marx puts like an edge on it, but this is old school political philosophy. But what makes bourgeois society clearer, for example, than Roman society, right? Well, in Roman society, you have multiple different classes, right? It doesn't sort of aggregate itself into these two major competing classes. The workers and the bosses, or the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, is not the entirety of classes in contemporary American society or even society at Marx's time. But they do start to define politics in a different way. When you look at Roman society, yeah, you have slaves and you have citizens, right? You have all of these different formations, depending on what people's relations to production, wealth, and social relations in general were in Roman society. But there wasn't like actually this like one clear two class system. It was a multiple class system, and you could see this all the way. If you read Shakespeare, you don't even have to read the classics, right? You know, who is Mark Antony, right, in the Roman system? He is the speaker of the plebs, right, which is something different from what the Senate represented, right, which was the citizens of Rome, right? So there's always been this understanding. Even political philosophers in Rome understood class nature of society. Too much of a preamble. Let's get to today. The modern bourgeois, let me get it right here. The modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class antagonisms. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses, however, this distinct feature. It has simplified class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat, right? And where does that struggle come from, Matt? Well, what happens in the former society? You have this rising merchant class in the cities, this rising financial class in feudal society, which was a society that was defined by the aristocracy and feudal lordship over the land, over the people, over the state, right? Well, as the economic system starts to shift, as the bourgeoisie and finance and capital and capitalism become more and more important, what did the bourgeoisie start demanding? Well, all of these things are telling us that we have to pay this much money to the king, or that the king has like ownership over our shit that he's asking us for constantly, that he needs to survive. Oh, we're not playing that game anymore. We actually have like inalienable rights that don't come from the king, but they come from God himself, right? These are the political developments that happen that move us from feudalism into capitalism, and that define our now modern era. The kind of world that we understand came out of a class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the old aristocracy, the old feudal lords, right? So already right here, we're seeing very clearly what Marx is talking about when he's talking about all of human history hitherto being a history of class struggle. Is there anything you want to add to that before we get to his flawless argument as to what proves Marx's theory of history wrong?
No, let's hit it.
All right, y'all take a deep breath. Anyone who's spent a lot of time reading Lenin or Rosa Luxemburg or anybody else is going to be flabbergasted by this next argument that he makes.
The history of existing society for all of human history has not actually been about class conflict. In fact, virtually no conflicts in the history of humanity have been fought purely over class. This is what World War I did to the Marxist idea. World War I.
And like, let's just note here, like this is very classic weasel thing, right? By saying purely over class. Well, Marx doesn't say that in that text, nor does Marx say that in the entire spectrum of his work. Matt and I just did a very in-depth reading, for example, of the 18th Brumaire, where Marx is talking about all of these contingencies that played into what was a class struggle, but all of the different competing inner capitalist class struggles that sort of led to the events there, right? So again, like by saying purely, he's trying to weasel his way out of something that is just truly absurd. But it won't matter in a second because he's about to say something so fucking stupid.
But yeah, I mean, sorry, like World War I, famous in like fucking. Okay, sorry.
Sorry, I didn't mean to take you.
No, I'll save it.
Defeated the Marxist idea. The Marxist idea in World War I is that there would be Europe-wide a class revolution to end World War I. In fact, the home of Marxist revolution was not supposed to be in Russia, which basically had no classes. It had like a group of a few elites, and then it had a giant proletariat. Basically farmers, serfs, people who were very poor. It wasn't supposed to happen in poor countries. If you look at Karl Marx's writings, it was supposed to happen in like Great Britain. It was supposed to happen in richer countries where the excesses of capitalism would eventually cause so much income inequality and wealth inequality that lower classes would rebel against upper classes. And thus, when World War I broke out, Marxists were utterly befuddled because instead of the conflict breaking out between lower classes, middle classes, and upper classes, the conflict instead broke out between nationalities. It broke out over borders. And Germans, who were very poor, sided with Germans who were very rich to fight British people who were very poor and British people who were very rich. And it didn't cross-pollinate across class.
Okay. So I want to get to the befuddled part, right? About like there not being world revolution going into World War One, right? But we'll get there in a second. Before we get there, Matt, um, wait, so like so what's the kind of pop understanding of World War One is this? Is that the Archduke Ferdinand gets assassinated, right? And there's too many alliances out there, too many agreements, and basically, it's the domino that falls, and then the world just falls into conflict. But if that were to be the case, doesn't that sound like more of a European problem, Matt? Why was this a world war instead of a petty European conflict?
Oh yeah, I mean, of course, it's funny the bluff. Like anybody familiar with any of this literature, like Eric Hobsbawm's probably The Age of Empire, maybe the most famous, but like there is imperial prestige and power. Germany was a rising power. The United Kingdom had control of it, but also like World War One literally led to the USSR. Like I don't know what the fuck.
You can't skip that for sure. But also, let's remember, there's this place. Ben Shapiro probably doesn't think about it too much, but there's this place pretty big. It's called Africa, right? Where not only was there conflict in this world war, which again supposed to be this parochial, fight between German nationality and English nationality, British nationality, right?
Over the
Well,
Archduke.
why is there Why is a world war? Well, it's because at the time going into this war, with a few notable exceptions, almost the entirety of the continent of Africa was controlled by European powers.
Yep.
And this is important, right? One, because of the morality and the humanity of what's going on, because it meant that there was a very distinct thing happening in the global economic order.
Yep.
What makes capitalism and what makes imperialism under capitalism distinct from, say, like early capitalist or colonial formations is finance. Because it's not just that the Europeans were taking raw resources from Africa, which they were, right, to build higher value goods in Europe. It was also about a huge flow of investment into Africa, not to help Africans, but because in Africa, what would you get? A much higher rate of return on your investment than if you were to invest in production in Europe. So it was a need of the people who had stockpiled capital at home in Europe to find a new home for that capital that would create massive returns that put tremendous political pressure to maintain and expand large colonial holdings. So the argument, right, that like, oh, France, this guy dies and then all of these like agreements just fall into place. Well, why were all those agreements being developed in the first place? It was because Europe was trying to carve up the rest of the world so that it could extract value from those societies, from that continent, from those people. That sounds very much like a class struggle that is ongoing, that is now engulfing the entire world into the financial needs of the European elites and the European bourgeoisie.
Yeah. I mean, the more he just doesn't understand what class means, right? Like he thinks it just means bosses are screwing people. So like that's why he had to skip the Civil War, for instance, because it's so blatantly like that dynamic. But he doesn't understand, like that's not like class just doesn't mean that you hate unions. I don't.
Not only does he skip it, but it's also like a great example as to why, for example, like the Civil War is like one of the most glorious, in American history. Like, right, that's a glorious struggle to end slavery. What happens in the years after? Well, the Northern finance and industrialists, there's not that much interest in sort of revolutionizing the South, right? Or following through on Reconstruction. They got fucking cotton mills to run up in New Hampshire or wherever in the Northeast, right? And they stop, pursuing this. That can't be, that's something that might be very difficult for like an idealist philosopher, an idealist historian to understand. But for a Marxist, it makes tremendous sense. Now, on the second charge that he lays out, like this is like that's a real fair charge to make, right? Not about Marxist theory of history, but this is like one of the disasters of World War One. It's the end of the Second International. It's the destruction of so much of the socialist and the communist movement because the SPD, the German Social Democratic Party, voted for war taxes along with the rest of the bourgeois parties, right? This was something that was massively resisted by the working class. Rosa Luxemburg is famously murdered during this period of time. But, let's not bore everybody with German history. I know no one cares or, knows enough about it. Let's come to the United States of America, where there was a very famous guy named Eugene Debs who was jailed for inciting the labor movement to oppose participation in World War I. Yeah. Or to a little shout out to our good friends in the South, our good friends in Australia, which also had like a very, very pronounced labor movement and resistance to World War I. So yes, it is true that global revolution doesn't happen in the terms of in World War I. It does very notably happen in a world historic way in Russia. But why does it not happen? Because of structural failures in the German case, structural failures across the board, but also because the capitalist class and the state brutally crushed labor and the anti-war opinions of working class people.
When we had Anders Leon, when you were gone, David, we talked to Minnesota, and like tarring and feathering in Minnesota for and AC Townley jailed, like absolutely, like and we forget about. I have mixed feelings of Hollywood's new appreciation for the Red Scare and how brave everyone was for it, because I don't think it's fully it's not communist in the sense that it's not putting this in a long history. It was this is when it really affected us. Well, what about the 20s? What about the 1870s? Right? Those were literal Red Scares too, literally called such at the time. And we just think that it happened once. Yeah.
Let's let him finish, because I was just going to end it there. That's sort of the end of the history and political philosophy lesson. But I think it would be unfair to play Ben Shapiro in that context without letting him get to where he's going. So let's let him finish this point for a second.
Marx was wrong. World War I proved him wrong. But his idea continues to be the motivating factor in nearly all thinking politically still, which is the idea that economic circumstances determine class solidarity, which in turn determines politics. And it's not true. The real answer to the driving force behind history is, in fact, community. Community of interest. If we were going to rephrase Marx, what we would come up with is the history of all hitherto existing societies, the history of community struggles. Struggles between creedal communities, religious communities.
So, I mean...
It's stupid. Look at. I'm reading a book on 1848 by Christopher Clark, and it's about how that blew up across the entire continent, right? So not you're just one community against this neighboring community, which is not negative. No, it was around these structures like feudalism and republicanism that which is again which classes decide what.
Look, there are differences all across the board in culture and communities, right? In the United States, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, etc. Why does it seem that history does sort of line up in the way that it does? Why does the 20th century look the way that it does? Well, it's not about this idea that it's in Brazil, the unique Brazilian communities. No, Brazil, there was massive class struggle, right? In Chile, right, there's massive class struggle. In the United States, there's massive class struggle. These are wildly different societies with wildly different communities, with wildly different religious traditions, right?
Yeah. I mean, bizarre. Ultimately, a lot of them financed by the colonial period by the same banks, right? I mean, they're not all different, but yeah, I mean, Ben, look, open patreon.com/leftreckoning. You can join everybody else here.
It's on Marxist.org, Bubba. It's free. You could go and read the rest of the book. Read it, please.
Sometimes you need commentary. Look, it's
that's true. No, yeah, we shouldn't undersell ourselves. Yeah.
Exactly. So look, we're a value add. That $50 million you didn't give Steven Crowder. Patreon.com/leftreckoning. That'd be.
And I'll always say, Ben wrote a great piece. I'm forgetting which journal it was in, but Marx deserves better critics. There's something that drives me nuts. I'm always when somebody sends me something like this, I'm like, well, maybe this is gonna be something that's gonna, get me somewhere interesting, even if I don't agree. Right? They're just so fucking dumb. They just don't interact with the source text. They create these The only person this appeals to is somebody who has no conception of Marx, right? Look, I'm not faulting people for that, right? We all learn different things. But Lord in heaven, it is truly embarrassing, excuse me, to be a right winger and have spent zero time dealing with your antithesis, right? I've read Smith, right? Frankly, a lot of these guys don't even understand Adam Smith.
Of course, yeah, absolutely not. Woke, I think.
Hell yeah, I guess he would be woke now.
What you're gonna tell the capitalists they should take it easy and not rupture society entirely? I think that he does say that, right? Like that's a little bit woke.